But my philosophy is very simple. When you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, say something, do something, get in trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble.
Strength and solidarity. The strength and solidarity. Divided is our nation, combating and fighting hatred. The mission, should you choose to accept it, is fighting racist psychology. It's just a space where we run in our simulations. We load you up with the tools, then we plug you into the matrix. So have a seat on the couch, now tell me your situation. Take a look in the mirror, be honest, just who you facing. Marginalized as a youth, what challenges were you faced with? Feeling you wasn't equal, told that you wouldn't make it. Your ID isn't real, got you constantly trying to fake it. Hiding behind masks in the closet till you can't take it. Getting harder to breathe, someone choking you on the pavement. Unspeakable violence attacking you cause you Asian. Accomplices, we accomplish through collaboration. Engaging, educating, evaluating one another. Liberating the future of all our sisters and brothers. Empowering, elevating all communities of color. Strength and solidarity. The strength and solidarity.
The Strength and Solidarity podcast is a conversational piece that invites scholars, community activists, leaders, artists, and entrepreneurs to discuss their work as accomplices in cultivating cross-racial ethnic solidarity. Hosted and produced by Pooja Mamidana and Dr. Dana Demenarid. It strives to engage, educate, evaluate, and empower communities of color, one episode at a time. Our guest today features Dr. Kevin Cokley, the president of the American Psychological Association, Division 45. In today's episode, we will be discussing his presidential theme of the task force, which is Confronting Racism Through Cross-Racial Ethnic Solidarity toward being an accomplice. Dr. Kevin Cokley is an Oscar and Annie Mauzy Regents Professorship for Educational Research and Development in the College of Education at the University of Texas at Austin. He is a Fellow of the University of Texas System and University of Texas Academy of Distinguished Teachers, Chair of the Department of Educational Psychology, Professor of Educational Psychology and African Diaspora Studies, and past Director of the Institute for Urban Policy Research and Analysis. Starting in August 2022, he will be a professor of psychology and associate chair for diversity initiatives in psychology at the University of Michigan. His research and teaching can be broadly categorized in the area of African American psychology, with a focus on racial identity and understanding the psychological and environmental factors that impact African American students' academic achievement. Dr. Cokley studies the psychosocial experiences of African American students and students of color, and is currently exploring the impostor phenomenon and its relationship to mental health and academic outcomes. He is the past editor-in-chief of the Journal of Black Psychology, holds the title of Distinguished Psychologist, and received the Scholarship Award from the Association of Black Psychologists. He is the president of Division 45, which is the Society of the Psychological Study of Culture, Ethnicity, and Race, and he was elected to fellow status in the American Psychological Association for his contributions to ethnic minority psychology and counseling psychology. He is the recipient of the Regents Outstanding Teaching Award, the Charles and Shirley Thomas Award for mentoring ethnic minority students, and the 10 Rising Stars of the Academy Award by Diverse Issues in Higher Education. He is the author of the 2014 book, The Myth of Black Anti-Intellectualism, which challenges the notion that African American students are anti-intellectual. He is also the editor of the 2021 book, Making Black Lives Matter, Confronting Anti-Black Racism. He has written several op-eds in the major media outlets on topics such as critical race theory, Blacks' rational mistrust of police, the aftermath of Ferguson, police and race relations, racism and white supremacy, the importance of ethnic studies, and racial disparities in school discipline. His research has been recognized in media outlets including the New York Times, USA Today, and Inside Higher Education. Dr. Cokley is a proud African American psychologist who embraces a collectivist worldview that places the concerns of the Black collective over individual concerns. He is a tireless defender of Black people and Black culture. His philosophy is illustrated by the Kenyan theologian John Mbidi. I am because we are, and because we are, therefore I am. He has an African-centered or Afrocentric worldview that sees people of African descent as central, rather than marginal, to human civilization. Hi, Dr. Kevin Cokley. Thank you for being here on our podcast today, Strength and Solidarity with Dr. Donna. Our goal for this podcast is to honor our roots and amplify the art of storytelling, much like how knowledge and wisdom are passed down in our communities. We would like to pay homage to our ancestors, our grandparents, our elders, our parents, aunties, uncles, and anyone in our family and our chosen family. We would love for our guests to share what is important to them and for us to know what led them to their life's journey as a healer, scholar, teacher, leader, and/or activist.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're very glad to have you here. Thank you.
That is a good question. And first of all, thank you both for doing this wonderful and very important podcast. I have been on this journey as a professor and scholar activist for almost 25 years. And it's been quite a remarkable journey. I come from a very small town, rural town in North Carolina called Pilot Mountain. And it was a town that did not have a lot of people of color. And it was a town that, had a fair amount of racism. But nevertheless, I was able to thrive. I had a wonderful set of parents who emphasized education, and I was able to go to college near home, Wake Forest University, and that is really where my consciousness started to become clear when I learned about sort of what it meant to be, a Black person, in this country, a Black person negotiating and navigating predominantly white educational spaces. And I became somewhat of an activist on campus. I was very involved in the Black Student Alliance. We were very socially engaged during the time that I was in college, which of course was a few years ago. The major issue at that time was South African apartheid. Mm-hmm. And we engaged in, I remember one, very sort of prominent activist activity on campus where we staged essentially a demonstration in the school cafeteria. We had some white allies who were also involved. And, we went to the cafeteria and while people were eating, we started to just grab white females out of their seats and pretended to, start dragging them out of the cafeteria. And of course, these women were involved. So they were, allies or accomplices, if you will. And we did that to sort of illustrate that during that time in South Africa, that Black folks could be, for any reason given by the government, could be just sort of just taken from wherever they were, particularly if they were involved in activism. And so we were just showing what it was like to be Black in South Africa and just sort of turning the tables, if you will. And so that's really one of my earliest memories of being involved in activism. So being an activist and being a scholar, that's always been a very important part of my professional identity. And of course, fast forward many, many years, and I get my PhD in counseling psychology from Georgia State University, and I start this journey of being a scholar activist. And, if I'm honest, I would say that, the first part of that journey was really focused on trying to get promoted and tenured, because I wanted to make sure that I was around so that I could be involved in activism. And, for me, that meant being able to be promoted and tenured. So I would say that my activism probably picked up after I was promoted and tenured, and I had some job security, and I was able to sort of be much more involved.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and by the way, happy Juneteenth.
Thank you very much. Of course, being here in Texas, Juneteenth takes on a special significance. So thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing with us how, I really like to hear from our guests how we really how our roots really began, and like what led us to the path that we've, chosen for ourselves and for our broader community. So it was really nice to hear kind of how your journey with activism began right from like college days and to where you are right now, which leads us to wanting to like understand from you, what was the thought process behind, okay, so you did activism at your college level and then you wanted to, get a job, to get secured with your job. And can you share with us a little, how did you get involved in like your leadership with APA and ABPSI?
Yeah, some interesting stories there. So I'll start with ABPSI. ABPSI, of course, Association of Black Psychologists, I really consider to be my professional home. Mm-hmm. I became involved in ABPSI back as a graduate student, and in fact, I first heard about ABPSI attending the American Counseling Association conference. It was in Atlanta, Georgia. I was a graduate student at that time, and I remember attending a session, and I heard this phenomenal scholar that I had read about named Thomas Parham. And after his session, I went to introduce myself, and I was just sort of in awe of this sort of academic sort of superstar, if you will. And I was telling him how much I was enjoying the conference, and because I was, attending all the people of color sessions, which for the American Counseling Association is the AMCD, is Association of Multicultural Counseling and Development. And so I remember him saying, if you think that this is something, you should go to the Association of Black Psychologists convention. And I had never heard of that. I was like, what? Yeah. There's an Association of Black Psychologists? And I was like, where do I sign up? And so that was where I first heard about it. And of course, I attended my first conference, ABPSI conference, as a graduate student in Philadelphia, and the rest is history. I literally grew up in ABPSI. I was, the student leader at one point. Then I've held various leadership positions. I was the Midwestern regional representative. I was the editor of the Journal of Black Psychology for a number of years. And so ABPSI has always been very important, and I've always tried to, get my graduate students involved as well. And for years, I've taken them to the conference so that they could be exposed. And so ABPSI is my professional home and heart. APA, I became involved in, interestingly, because of an individual named Dr. A.J. Franklin. And Dr. Franklin, when he was president of Division 45, he, needed to appoint someone to be the membership chair. And I was, young and upcoming scholar. And so he, appointed me as the membership chair. And interestingly, people might find this interesting. I really didn't intend on getting involved in APA. I had some feelings about APA, some somewhat negative perceptions of APA, and I had sort of decided, I'm not going to get involved. But then when my elder, who was also a longtime member of ABPSI, when Dr. Franklin, sort of asked me to be the membership chair, I said, well, my elder is asking me. And so I didn't think I could say no. And so that's how I became involved in Division 45. And I've been involved ever since.
It kind of thank you for sharing that. It kind of reminds me of my journey, because I feel like in graduate schools, they don't really talk about, at least in my school, they have not really spoken much about professional associations and things like this exist. So as a person of color, when I moved here when I was 23, it was really, I always felt othered because I was the only South Asian in my class and professional clinical practicums I held. And that's when I met Dr. Helen Su, incoming president-elect of Division 45. And I was like, I want to be connected to other Asian Americans. I want to be connected to other South Asians. So I got introduced to AAPA in 2016. And that's how I started my leadership journey. And when you were talking about Dr. Franklin, it reminded me of how you and I got connected, Dr. Cokley, where I've heard so much about you. And I was like, okay, I'm really fascinated by this person and I want to get to know him more. So I reached out to you, and that's how we're here today. So it's really nice to also hear many years later at different generations also how, as communities of color, the wisdom and knowledge and the respect we have for our elders, and how, they're part of that journey with us, even elders we meet in the field. So just wanted to say that.
I just have to say, it's hard to say no to elders. It really is.
Yes, it is.
So what is the thought process behind the initiative of your presidential team?
So the thought process about my presidential initiative?
Yeah, for Division 45.
Yeah. Well, it's been an interesting journey for me. I've always been interested in promoting collaboration and just sort of cross-ethnic and cross-racial solidarity. I mean, even before I sort of officially named it as my theme, but it's something that's just, I think, intuitively always felt like the right thing to do. And as president, actually, I was trying to think what would be a good presidential theme. And I think what really, to be honest with you, what really prompted me to kind of go into this direction was what happened during, the Black Lives Matter movement. And I was so impressed and touched, especially by the Asian solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. I remember seeing, so many examples of people of Asian descent expressing their solidarity with Black people in the Black Lives Matter movement, and that really touched me. And if I'm being totally honest, I also felt a little bad because I wasn't sure if I had seen that type of solidarity expressed by Black people for people of Asian descent. And so I said, this is something that I think we need to discuss and we need to do, to be more actively engaged in. And so that's really where the motivation came. And so once I thought about it, I said, this would be a good presidential theme to just really sort of talk about the importance of promoting cross-racial and cross-ethnic solidarity. White supremacy impacts all of us.
Right.
And we're not going to be able to really sort of defeat white supremacy by ourselves, working in isolation. We really need the collective efforts of all of us if we're going to sort of be successful. And I think that's really what prompted me to go in this direction.
Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely can relate. The whole is definitely greater than the sum of its parts. And I think with my privilege, I studied in an international school from kindergarten to grade 12 in India. So I've always been around folks from different walks of life who have multiracial ethnic identities. So when I moved to this country, it was a huge acculturation for me to really understand why is there so much divide and why aren't communities of color coming together and supporting one another? Why is there so much oppression that happens within communities of color to each other? So I'm really grateful, and we're so happy that we kind of have to change the generational patterns, the multi-generational trauma that exists within our communities. And I feel like as young leaders and future, mid-career and early career leaders, we're part of that change. And if we don't take that step, then we're going to kind of keep doing the same thing for our future generations. So thank you for
starting that for us at Division 45. And I'm hoping that as presidents come over the years, we can continue to build that strength and solidarity.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And speaking of, it's difficult to say no to your elders. When you had approached me about co-chairing, this solidarity task force, of course I'm going to say yes. It's just not an option. And knowing how you were, and I've met you through my my old podcast, the Cross Aisle Talk, and knowing your background, and I have such deep respect for what you do and what you're doing, and I want to be a part of that. So, and I know we've talked about this, but for the purpose of the podcast and our audience, if you can talk a little bit about your vision for this solidarity task force. What is your vision for this task force?
Well, my vision for the task force is that we come away with some tangible products and tangible directions where we can, as communities of color, more actively engage in supporting each other. Division 45, by its nature, sort of does that already. People of color are coming together,
right?
Sort of around, commonly held values and issues of importance. And so it's in many ways it's already built into the presence of Division 45. But I want us to be more intentional, because I don't think that we shouldn't take for granted that just because there's an organization for us that we're automatically going to be inclined to just sort of support each other and all of the struggles that our communities experience. And so my vision for the Solidarity Task Force is that we can actualize our communities actually being proactively supportive of each other beyond just having an organization where we all sort of convene.
And what does that look like? What are these tangible things that you're talking about? What does that look like?
So for example, whenever there is an important issue that has impacted, one of our communities, I would like to see members of other communities speak out, on behalf of those communities. It shouldn't be just the individuals, the communities that are impacted or that are speaking out. I would like to see other community members outside of those communities who would also sort of speak out as if it was impacting their own communities. Because if it happens to one of us, we should all be feeling the impact, and should all be concerned. And so to me, that's the most obvious way. And I don't know that we see a lot of that. We see a little bit of it, like, certainly on the Division 45 listserv, for example, you'll see, sort of comments from folks outside of communities that are being impacted. Like for example, with the Buffalo shootings, that certainly, impacted a lot of Black people. I think there were some comments from people, outside of the Black communities, or, when, you have, Asian Americans, being targeted for anti-Asian violence, I think that there have been some commentary from people who aren't Asian, but not nearly enough. I would like to see that happen more frequently, and something that we all sort of take ownership and responsibility for doing.
Yeah. So, because I know I've heard in conversations that there is this fatigue that people in the communities feel, that how can we go out there and help out other communities of color when we ourselves are still steep in that trauma? How can we go outside of that? I always find that very interesting.
Yeah, no, it's not easy, and I don't pretend that it is. But if you are a student of history, and if you look at various sort of social movements that have taken place, you'll see that they all have been multiracial, multi-ethnic, that people have always gotten involved in fighting the good fight, on issues that maybe aren't directly related to their own lived experience. So that's always been a part of our historical reality.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that. And you also mentioned earlier about this whole idea of allyship. But I know in our mission and vision, we use the term accomplice. So why the term accomplice and not ally?
Yeah, so this was something that I actually became educated about as I was putting together, or as I was sort of thinking about what my presidential theme would be. Of course, we hear the word ally and allyship used quite a bit, with the idea, I think, being that people are sort of, supporters of. It's usually been used to refer to white folks who are working, who are sort of allies to people of color, who are sympathetic to the causes of people of color, and they want to sort of communicate that, hey, we're with you, we've got your back, we recognize our white privilege. So typically the word allyship has been used to with white people as a reference point. But one of the criticisms, or a couple of things. One, you don't typically think of allyship within the context of people of color. I mean, that's not usually the way the term is used. I mean, there may be some exceptions, but it's typically you think about sort of white allies. So that's one sort of problem. But the other problem is that the term itself has tended to be more. It has been more passive. It has been almost more performative. That is,
I was thinking that just now.
More performative. It's common to sort of say, we're your allies, but there's no accountability. There's very little sort of action. One can sort of claim to be an ally, and that not be tied to actually specific actions. And so the word accomplice is much more action oriented. It's not performative as I understand it, and it really sort of it really indicates that there is we are going to sort of work in tandem with you as your accomplice for whatever sort of change that needs to take place. So it goes beyond the sort of performative nature of the word allyship. I see it as being sort of accountable. When I say that I'm your accomplice, it means we're in the trenches together. We're working together on whatever the issues may be.
Yeah, I like that. It's basically similar to what Dr. Calvin Sims and I, my co-chair for this task force, we like to say we like to make good trouble together. So he's my accomplice in that.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite quotes that I actually used at the AAPA keynote, and it kind of also makes me think of an accomplice is someone who could be a ride or die also, through this solidarity work.
That's right.
Yeah, we're going to ride and die together. So I know you alluded to this earlier too about, the history in many communities of color, and there's a lot of hurt and trauma within and between these communities. And so there's these what we call fragile alliances. Can you talk a little bit more about that to give an example of what that may mean for those folks who may not really know what that is?
So the term fragile alliances refers to this idea that within the context of communities of color, that we are all sort of minoritized groups that have been victimized by white supremacy, and we recognize that, and so we see that as being an instant sort of marker of us having some sort of shared reality, and presumably sort of working towards the same goal. Yet the alliances are fragile because our histories, our pain is different. We don't have the same lived experiences. Although certainly we're all impacted by white supremacy, but we've all been impacted by white supremacy differently.
Right.
And so sometimes what ends up happening is that there can be an oppression Olympics that takes place where some groups might feel like, where your pain is not the same as my pain. It is not as deep and as harmful as my pain, or vice versa. And so it can lead to situations where the alliances are very fragile, because it only takes one misstep to sort of reveal the deep pain and wound that our communities have experienced. I'll use myself as an example. I sent out a presidential message on the Division 45 listserv, and my intent was to try to cover, sort of some of the major issues of hurt that were being experienced by communities that I was aware of.
Mm-hmm.
And so I sent the message out, and I was sort of told that essentially that, I had left out Native Americans, indigenous people, and some recent pain that had been sort of uncovered for that community. And I wasn't aware of it, but it still was hurtful because they, I think, felt like their pain was not being acknowledged. And so when you're engaged in sort of this allyship work, you can't take things personally. You have to understand the pain that these different communities are experiencing. And so I took that feedback. I resent my presidential the email to make sure that it included all examples of pain across our various communities. And again, it wasn't intentional on my part because I actually wasn't aware of it. But that's why we have to be so conscientious and just so mindful of the sort of messages that we are saying, that we are sending. Who are we leaving out? Who's not being included? And it's a lot of work. It's not easy. And sometimes we make mistakes and missteps. And that was an example of one that I made, and I owned it, and I tried to correct it.
Yeah, I saw that email thread, and when I saw your response after somebody had mentioned, hey, you left out this community, I just had so much more respect for you, that humility that you showed, in response to that, and revised your statement. Sir, props. I was just so proud. Like, wow, that is, a great example of a leader right there. For me.
And I think also that speaks volumes to, as leaders or as activists or people like from this community. If we do make a mistake, which is not intentional, like owning up to that, being open to learning, and kind of reframing, okay, hey, I'm sorry, thank you for bringing this to my awareness. And I like how you said earlier that it shouldn't be taken personally, because there's so much that we don't really know also with, like, I'm sure like there are many other communities also that if we really think about it internationally and how many immigrants we have, there's a lot that can be left out, not intentionally. So thank you for also sharing that yes, it's important for us to be intentional, but even if we do make a mistake, when it's not coming from a place of harm.
Yeah, definitely. And I think when people do take it personally, it's part of that colonized mentality where people think, I have to be perfect. I have to lead, I have to be a good leader. People cannot see my mistakes. That is like that colonial mentality that we've internalized.
No, it absolutely is. I mean, I have always tried to be very transparent in who I am and my vulnerabilities and frailties. And when I teach multicultural counseling, I always use myself as an example for the mistakes that I've made in this journey that I've been on to sort of being more multiculturally, sort of competent, if you will. And I think my students over the years have appreciated the fact that when I'm teaching them about these very important issues, that I'm not afraid to share the mistakes that I've made along the way. Because I think in doing that, it makes them, it helps them to feel more comfortable and sort of owning and talking about their mistakes and the growth of their and the journey that they're on. Professors, I don't think that professors are comfortable with sharing that level of vulnerability and transparency with their students. We're put on these pedestals and made to sort of feel like we are like perfect and are not mistake prone. But we make mistakes and we're not prone. We're not perfect. And so I think it's important that our students see that about us and see that we're comfortable with owning that and sharing it with them. And I've always tried to be that way.
Yeah, definitely. That is a good message to us professors that we're not perfect.
And like also like it doesn't matter if you're a professor of color or like you're a Eurocentric professor. Like in my experience, I've had to kind of provide some psychoeducation with my professors who are white or my clinical supervisors who are white, and unfortunately, that openness of teaching them about like South Asians or like other communities of color I've worked with, there's not that openness to learning. So it becomes like a power dynamic that you experience. So I really appreciate how, and Dr. Donna, I've been part of your multicultural class as well, where you kind of take that same approach in teaching your class. So I think it's beautiful to even show your students that you're modeling that behavior, right? Like you're humanizing that approach that, hey, this is how I got here, but these are also the adversities and the mistakes I've had, and this is kind of how I've worked on myself. So thank you both for sharing that.
Well, I have, good models, one like right here, present right now. So yeah, definitely. That's what we're hoping, right? The next generation.
That's right. Yes.
So in terms of this whole fragile alliances, how do you think this could, in terms of our task force, how do you think this fragile alliance can benefit our task force, our solidarity task force, or even be a hindrance or a barrier?
Well, I think it could be a benefit if we can make sure that the work that is produced from the task force is inclusive and is representative and does not leave, communities out. I mean, I think that's going to be really, really critical, which is why I try to make sure that the composition was very diverse and inclusive. And I think that we were able to accomplish that. And of course, the barrier would be if we end up sort of producing sort of work that it was not inclusive, did not sort of represent, sort of the full range of experiences that our communities, sort of have. And so I hope that doesn't happen. And I think that by having a diverse task force, that you have people who are positioned to be able to speak to the different experiences from different communities. And if we're successful, then our task force can be a model for Division 45 on how you can work together and to promote and to be invested in issues of communities that may not be reflective of your own community, but you still nevertheless feel equally invested in addressing those issues. And so I hope that our task force can model that.
Yeah, definitely. So I know earlier we spoke about how when, a community of color is kind of going through something, it's important for us to show up, to be there, and to feel that pain as our own as well. Because as you mentioned rightfully, that this history that we're all part of, it wasn't just one community that created this history or, fought the fight for us. It was a lot of us from different diverse ethnic backgrounds. So I know that's one way we can be active accomplices for marginalized communities, but what are some other ways, like tangible ways, we can continue to be active accomplices for various marginalized communities?
Well, I mean, and one way that comes to mind, and it's not going to be easy, is is looking within our own communities and addressing any issues of bias and discrimination, dare I say even racism. I mean, although some people feel differently about whether folks of color can be racist, but certainly addressing those issues that exist within our communities, and that's never easy. So for example, if I'm with other Black folks and I hear some anti-Asian sentiments, some anti-Latinx sentiments, some anti-Indigenous sentiments, it is my responsibility to address that and to remind my community why that's problematic and why we should not be a participant in essentially the perpetuation of sort of white supremacy. And so I think that all of our communities need to be engaged in that sort of work. I mean, I've heard from other groups that anti-Blackness is real and is prominent amongst all of our communities, and I think that we all should sort of address that and all the other ways and different biases that we know exist amongst our communities, that we need to not be passive and we should not accept that as just the standard, as the status quo, that we need to actively sort of confront that and to address it. And that if we do that, we're not always going to be the most popular individuals within our communities. But I do feel like that is our responsibility if we're going to be serious about this work.
Yeah. And it's even more difficult if it's an elder who expresses that. And, if you are kind of in the lower ranks, so to speak, it's difficult to confront an elder in your community,
I've definitely gotten a lot of good trouble from grade second up until now. I think my first exposure and activism began as a child because my family was like, okay, I'm going to socially, culturally raise you in an international school with different folks of life. But then when I would come home, I would hear different messages from from my grandparents or from my parents, and racist comments about other communities of color. And I knew at a very young age that's wrong. How could you be saying that about another community? So I think my exposure of getting in good trouble started in my family, and it obviously didn't stop there, because when I moved to this country, I have always been a young leader in leadership positions I've held. So being a young woman of color, being a young leader, being brave enough to kind of challenge the thoughts of your elders is something I've run into in AAPA a lot. And I really like how you said we first need to start with ourselves, move on to our community, and then maybe that translates into other social and occupational and religious spaces, and kind of going from there. But something that I'm still noticing in both these professional organizations I'm from is the multi-generational trauma that exists, and kind of even elders being stuck with not knowing how, I wouldn't say not knowing, but kind of ambivalence of moving forward, wanting to collaborate with other communities, and then saying exactly what you're saying, why should we involve them? Do they think about us and things like that? So I can definitely see that being a challenge, but we do need to start somewhere. And I feel like the task force you've appointed, we all do come from diverse communities. So I think it's also a good way to invite our collaborators from these other communities of color to be like, hey, we're starting this and we need your help to kind of also take this to the next level.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much.
So I guess we touched upon this a little bit, but I think some of the challenges that can be detrimental in cross-racial ethnic solidarity is, firstly, if we've not done that work ourselves, and not even done it within our family systems as well, and broader community. But what are some other challenges that we kind of did not explore that's coming to you that can be detrimental in cross-racial ethnic solidarity?
Well, I think that one of the other sort of challenges is there there are certain groups. Okay, how can I put it? There's sometimes a disproportionate. Well, I don't even know if I'll just put it like that. Sometimes it seems that some groups get a lot more attention than other groups.
Yeah.
And part of it is that there's an education piece. So again, using the example from earlier, like I was not aware of the issue that had been recently sort of in the news about Native American children. Like I just didn't know.
Yeah.
And so part of it is just an education issue. But then, being a part of the Black community, I can say this, I think that, Black folks, we get, a lot of attention. We, given our history, sort of enslavement and civil rights and everything that's involved Black people, that a lot of focus oftentimes is on the Black experience, and understandably so. But I think that what can sometimes happen is that the experiences of other communities gets lost or gets sort of muted or gets sort of minimized. And how do we sort of talk about that in ways that are productive and where people and folks don't get defensive? Those are not easy conversations to have, and yet they're very important conversations that we must have. And I think that we don't have a lot of good models or examples of how to productively have those conversations. To me, it would so part of what I wanted to do, for example, with the James Jones Conversation Hour, is I wanted to have I have examples of I have leaders from our communities who will hopefully be able to sort of start the conversation around these sort of very difficult issues. And hopefully that could be a model for our way forward, that we need to continue to have these important conversations. And then to your earlier question, moving beyond talk. So what do we do with this information? So we've talked about it. We know sort of where, how we are feeling, where we're coming from. But then what do we do with that? What does it look like to be an accomplice? And I'm not perfect in that regard. I mean, I think there are a lot of keyboard accomplices. It's easy to sort of tweet out something, send out an email. And I don't want to like minimize those things, because I mean those are certainly important. But what more can we do to support each other? What does that look like? And where are the examples that we can look to kind of help us sort of learn how to be better accomplices?
No, absolutely. And it kind of reminds me of, I've been through this. Like I was chair of DOSA, and majority, we do have like leaders in that board who are Hindu and like other like identities of South Asian identities that are kind of minoritized. And something that I would always hear from like our membership and from like the leaders itself is, oh, but the whole board is Hindu. So like when I was chair, I was like, okay, how do we change that? Like, okay, we can be more inclusive in the elections that we put out, but there's only so much that we also can do as leaders, right? Like trying to network, trying to figure out like how do we kind of make this happen. But something that I've also noticed in like these professional organizations is a lot of people have a lot to say in that moment. Like if we have like a healing space or like a reflection space, like people from minoritized communities do share what they want in those spaces. But I've noticed like any conversation or any dialogue after that, it kind of stops. And it kind of reminded me back to Dr. Donna's point earlier of fatigue or like not wanting to kind of give your energy there, but which kind of leads us back to this point of like, but if we don't put in that time, that effort, that energy, how is this going to happen, right? How is that change going to happen?
It's this vicious cycle. One thing that I have noticed too, that yes, even though we would have those conversations, I do feel that people are still tiptoeing around the edges, that people are not being their authentic self. When we're trying to do the solidarity work with other folks from other communities of color, there is still this tiptoeing around the edges. Like, I'm afraid to offend you, so I need to constantly watch what I say. And in the end, they're not, I don't know, they're not
being authentic.
They're not being genuine. But one thing that I find myself that I do is I like to do one-on-one. And once we build that bond, that trust, then we can be our authentic selves. And I know that if they were to say something, it's not out of malice.
Yes.
It's like, I get you. I'm there with you. So that's the hard work, is for you to put that time and energy to really build that relationship. And that takes time.
Yes.
And I think our vision, like for being producers of this podcast, is like inviting people we really look up to and people who are doing the work from like other communities, and like having them on this podcast, like really exploring together, like where are we right now?
Yeah.
Where do we need to go? And how can we get there together? I know we're all doing amazing work individually in these associations, but how can we make that stronger by coming together and collaborating on really putting something else out there?
Yeah, definitely. All right. So, was there anything else that you wanted to add?
I guess we just have our last question is just, what message do you have for young folks who want to engage in cross-racial ethnic solidarity work within our communities?
My message would be that you are our future. You in fact, you are our present, you are our future. And that we need you, and that if we're going to be successful in really addressing and ultimately, one day just defeating white supremacy, and I'm not suggesting that's going to be anytime soon, we are going to need the efforts of young people. And we can't do it alone. Our communities cannot do it by themselves. We need each other.
Definitely.
We always have, and we always will. And sometimes it takes young people to sort of who don't have the baggage of the elders to sort of lead the way.
Yes.
And we need you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Make that good trouble.
Yeah. And I mean, like, adding to that point, that thank you for providing me also this opportunity as a young leader, because you could see that in me. And I'm like, okay, no, I want to be able to also pull in other young leaders to be part of this task force. And it's amazing how, like, Dr. Donna and Dr. Calvin, like, have spoken about our task force in their multicultural classes and talking to their students about, hey, these are different ways you can get involved. And we actually have like undergrad students who are interns on part of our podcast team and social media team, who are just 18 or 19 years old, but are already starting like their journey in like activism, much like you back in the day. So I'm really happy that you shared that, because we are going to be the future. And it is also important to kind of start working on yourself early on and start understanding how this work, like you said, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, and it's something that we're going to do lifelong till literally our existence on this planet, till our last breath. And how do we continue that solidarity as we age also?
Definitely.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for your time, sir. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you both for really facilitating this wonderful podcast. It's been a pleasure.
It's so as ours. It's nice to kind of kick off, starting the podcast just with your words of wisdom, and then really hoping and seeing that we can bring in a lot of like other communities and continue to just do better and be stronger together.
Yeah, definitely. Quick question. I've always been curious. What's the significance of James Jones?
Well, where do we start? James Jones, of course, very prominent African American social psychologist who wrote the seminal textbook on racism and prejudice that for many years was really the leading sort of source of information about understanding the psychology of prejudice and racism.
Gotcha.
He and many people reference that source. He introduced to us the idea that racism occurs at 3 different levels. The individual, the institutional, at the cultural levels.
Mm-hmm.
That was something that came from him, and that many people have now referenced.
Mm-hmm.
He is just a very, very wise elder, someone whom I look up to and have a tremendous amount of respect for.
Gotcha. Okay. I've always been wondering, like, what is the significance of that? Because we're using the James Jones Conversation Hour for the conference.
Yeah, well, and not to mention, his, involvement in APA and the Minority Fellows program. He's done a lot, but he is a tremendous individual. If you ever have a chance to sort of meet him, I would encourage you to do so.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Well, you just gave us another podcast idea. So if you could network and
yes,
it would be amazing and like the most like honor for us to hear both of you in conversation and like being a guest on our podcast who's already done so much in the community and has is leaving this legacy behind. And thank you for asking what James Jones is. And for our listeners, we do have a conference coming up in August, and Division 45 gets a programming hour during that conference. So Dr. Cokley thought it would be really amazing to kind of honor Dr. Jones at this hour and have more cross-racial ethnic solidarity dialogues and discussions through that hour.
Yes.
Yeah, and just for clarification for your listeners, I did not create the James Jones Conversation Hour. That's something that has existed well before me. But presidents of Division 45 over the years have used that hour, or it used to be 2 hours, but have used that time, to sort of promote various aspects of their presidential initiative.
Thank you for correcting me. I did not know that, so I appreciate that.
Yes.
Awesome. All right.
Thank you for tuning in to our podcast today. We hope you enjoyed the episode. For more information about today's guest and their social media links, you can click on the description links of the episode. Pooja Mami Dana and Dr. Donna Demanari host this podcast. Our podcast team includes our podcast interns, Alexis Rios from the University of North Texas in Denton, Texas, and James Hopper from Wheaton College in Norton, Massachusetts. We also want to acknowledge our production team, David DeVito and Rachel Sheffer.
If you would like to know more about us or to watch video clips of this interview, then follow us on Instagram at APADiv45_Presidential Task Force, on Twitter at APADiv45_Cokley, or on YouTube and Facebook at Dr. Kevin Cokley, APA Division 45 Presidential Task Force.